Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return, once again, to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up, or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Now, close your eyes and imagine. A quiet European village. The year is 1347. The sun sets on stone cottages, and flickering lanterns line the narrow streets. But behind the hush of twilight, something unseen is beginning to stir. The Black Death, known to modern science as the bubonic plague, came not with a roar, but with a quiet, creeping dread. Its first victims were like shadows on the wind, falling ill with fever, fatigue, and a deep aching in their bones. Then came the swellings, the buboes, blackened and bursting with infection, most often found in the armpits and groin. Death came quickly, often within 3 to 5 days. And there was almost nothing anyone could do. The numbers are staggering even now. Between 75 and 200 million people perished across Eurasia. In Europe alone, it's believed that between 30 and 50% of the entire population was lost. It's a number so vast, so unthinkable, that historians and scientists still find themselves pausing in disbelief. Streets were emptied. Entire villages vanished without a trace. Mass graves were dug outside city walls. And yet, the plague did not discriminate by title or coin. Lords and laborers, merchants and monks, all were at risk. And so, for centuries, people assumed that the Black Death was blind in its devastation, that it took without preference, without pattern. But was it truly so indiscriminate? Enter anthropologist Sharon DeWitty, who would bring modern tools to bear on a very old question. Her idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Could studying the bones of plague victims and comparing them to the remains of those buried in ordinary, non-plague cemeteries tell us whether the disease was more selective than we thought? DeWitty, a scholar.
She began her work at Penn State, later continuing it at the University of South Carolina. With care and precision, she examined skeletal remains from 14th century plague pits, particularly in London, one of the hardest hit cities. Her goal was to identify signs of stress and hardship in the bones, malnutrition, past injuries, dental disease, or anything that might indicate how healthy or unhealthy a person had been before the plague reached them. What she discovered was quietly extraordinary. It turns out the Black Death didn't strike entirely at random. Individuals with weaker immune systems or with evidence of chronic illness were more likely to succumb to the plague. In other words, the disease was exerting selective pressure on the human population, a brutal and tragic version of natural selection. Those who survived may not have done so purely by chance. Their bodies, their genes, might have given them an edge. This insight opened a door to understanding not just how pandemics impact societies socially and economically, but evolutionarily as well. The survivors and their descendants may have inherited genetic advantages, stronger immune responses, greater resilience to certain infections. Some scientists even believe that changes triggered by the Black Death are still influencing European immune systems today, nearly 700 years later. It's a chilling thought that such immense suffering could shape the very biology of a continent. And yet, this is part of the strange paradox of history, that light sometimes filters through the darkest of hours. So tonight, as the world sleeps and you drift with it, let us remember that history is more than a tale of kings and wars. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and quiet resilience, not just in cities and cultures, but in bones and bloodlines, passed silently from one generation to the next. Now, let the candle of thought burn low. Let the echoes of medieval streets fade to stillness. You are safe, and the night is calm. In the shadowy corridors of history, the arrival of the plague in Europe reads like a quiet invasion. Swift, invisible, and relentless. It did not roar into towns with the sound of hooves or the cry of armies, but with coughs in the night, with swelling lymph nodes, and with the sudden stillness of morning. In the mid-1300s, as panic rose and hope dwindled, people searched desperately for an explanation. Many saw divine wrath in the suffering, punishment for greed, pride, or forgotten piety. Others turned fear into blame. Rumors spread like a plague itself, naming the innocent. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, lepers were cast out of towns they once called home, and travelers, once welcomed with stories from far-off lands, returned away at sword point. With no concept of germs, no laboratories, and no antibiotics, the world had little to defend itself with, except fear. In cities like Florence, Avignon, and London, fear manifested in cruel ways. Some locked their doors from the inside, others from the out. Homes were sealed with the sick still inside. Entire families vanished behind wooden doors that no one dared open again. Priests and monks, some of the few brave enough to offer last rites or comfort, died in great numbers. Burial pits overflowed. New cemeteries rose like grim gardens on the edges of towns. And yet, beyond the chaos and confusion, a deeper cause slowly emerged. One not born of punishment or conspiracy, but of empire, movement, and chance. The Mongol Empire, a force of both violence and order, stretched across Asia and into Europe, like no empire before. Its vast system of roads and trade routes, the famed Silk Road, allowed for the exchange of spices, silks, culture, and knowledge. But in its wake also came death. Along with trade caravans and merchant fleets, the plague traveled effortlessly, hiding in the fur of rats and the bellies of fleas. Where the Mongols had once galloped, disease followed in silence. One chilling turning point came at the siege of Kaffa in Crimea. Gabriel de Mussy, a notary who chronicled the event, described how Mongol forces, beset by plague themselves, began catapulting the corpses of their own dead over the city walls. The people of Kaffa, trapped inside, had no escape. Those who survived fled by sea, unknowingly bringing the infection to Italy's bustling ports. The ships that docked in Genoa, Venice, and Messina in 1347 and 1348 were not carrying just wine, wool, or grain. They carried a microscopic invader that would rewrite the fate of millions. From there, the disease fanned out with terrifying speed. In May 1348, it arrived in England through the southern port of Melcombe Regis. Within weeks, it had reached London. By September, the capital was in full crisis. Death knocked on every door. From nobles to peasants, no one was spared. Within months, the countryside, too, began to empty. Fields went unplowed. Sheep wandered through abandoned pastures. Oxen died in their yokes, and granaries overflowed with rotting grain. The entire fabric of medieval society strained under the weight of so many losses. And yet, as modern science would later discover, the plague was not one singular force, but three. The first was the classic bubonic form, which spread through flea bites and left behind the painful, dark swellings that gave the disease its name. The second was pneumonic plague, deadlier still, transmitted by breath and touch, spreading like wildfire through crowded households and markets. The third form, septicemic plague, entered the bloodstream directly and often killed its host before any visible symptoms emerged. Only in recent decades have researchers been able to confirm that all three were at work. Through the analysis of ancient DNA extracted from the teeth and bones of victims buried centuries ago. The culprit was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, a tiny organism that changed the trajectory of continents. Today, we understand more than our ancestors could ever dream. Yet we still feel the echo of their loss. The streets they once walked, the books they left unwritten, the hands they never held again. And yet, through the suffering, something else emerged: resilience. The survivors passed on more than just their stories. They passed on the strength that helped shape the genetic and social landscapes of Europe for generations. And now, as the lanterns of memory dim and the quiet of the night deepens, let your breath slow and your thoughts soften. History has taken its turn. You've walked beside it for a time, and now it fades into the gentle hush of sleep. What doesn't kill you, they say, makes you stronger. And in the case of the Black Death, this old saying may carry more truth than ever imagined. For all its horror, the plague left behind more than empty villages and unmarked graves. It also left behind a human population subtly changed, biologically, socially, and genetically. Anthropologist Sharon DeWitt, driven by the need to understand health in a past with scientific precision, found in the Black Death an unparalleled opportunity. With exclusive plague cemeteries, like East Smithfield in London, offering large, temporally concentrated samples, she was able to study the victims not as nameless casualties, but as pieces of a larger evolutionary puzzle. In her PhD research, DeWitt examined 490 skeletons from this cemetery and compared them with 291 skeletons from Denmark's Viborg and Odense cemeteries. Burials from ordinary times, untouched by epidemic. She assessed the skeletal markers of frailty, bone lesions from infection, signs of malnutrition, delayed growth, and dental disease. The result? A clear pattern emerged. The plague had been ruthless, but not random. Those with poorer health markers were disproportionately swept away, regardless of age. Older individuals and those already weakened by hunger or illness were more likely to succumb. The Black Death, then, did not merely kill. It selected. It moved through Europe like a cruel, natural filter, sparing those with stronger immune systems, more robust physiologies, or perhaps even favorable genes. Over time, this meant that those who survived were more likely to pass on those traits that had protected them. DeWitt posits that this created a powerful force of natural selection on a massive scale, shaping the future of European health for generations. But the consequences of the plague were not only biological. Socially and economically, Europe was reborn. With nearly half the population gone, the value of labor soared. Serfs once tied to the land and beholden to their lords found they had new bargaining power. Many fled manors and sought work elsewhere. Others demanded wages and better conditions. A laborer could now claim abandoned farmland or inherit property from deceased relatives. For the first time in centuries, the rigid hierarchy of feudalism cracked. There was more land, more food, and, curiously, more freedom. The foundations of the middle class were laid amid the ashes of suffering. And the evidence of this quiet transformation lies not only in records, but in the bones themselves. In her later studies, DeWitt explored the long-term biological aftermath of the plague by examining another 464 skeletons from pre-Black Death cemeteries and 133 from burials post-1350. She looked again at lesions, height, and age at death. What she found was striking. People who lived after the plague were, on average, healthier. They lived longer. There were fewer signs of chronic illness in the bones. And crucially, more individuals reached their 50s, 60s, and even beyond. This suggests that the survivors and their descendants were more resilient. The trauma of the Black Death had culled the weakest and left behind a population better able to thrive. As the generations passed, this hidden inheritance whispered through family trees. Stronger immune systems, improved nutrition, and perhaps even a deeper collective memory of how fragile life can be. So the story of the Black Death is not simply one of death, but of survival. In the silence that followed, in the empty churches and fallow fields, humanity began again, not in triumph, but in quiet endurance. Now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavier and the echoes of distant centuries fade into the stillness of your room, take comfort in knowing that we are all, in some small way, the children of survivors. The night is calm. The past is behind you. Though DeWitt's studies provide compelling evidence for a long-term improvement in survival and health among the post-plague population, not all scholars agree with her conclusions. Jens Råkasten of the University of Birmingham, for instance, analyzed a different kind of historical evidence. Wills. These legal documents, primarily left behind by wealthier men, reveal a disturbing pattern. Distinct spikes in mortality corresponding with known plague recurrences in 1361, 1368, 1375, 1382, and 1390. These bursts of death recorded in ink on aging parchment, paint a picture of continued devastation long after the initial Black Death swept through Europe. But wills, by their nature, represent a narrow slice of society. They rarely capture the experiences of women, children, servants, peasants, or the desperately poor. Those whose lives were too ordinary or too fragile to leave paper trails. De Wit argues that bones, unlike documents, do not discriminate. Her bioarchaeological evidence reveals stories buried under the earth, told by the lesions on ribs, the worn enamel of teeth, and the healed fractures of aging limbs. These remains speak not of the privileged few, but of a broader population. Fishermen, farmers, brewers, shepherds, people whose daily lives quietly shaped medieval Europe. Across nearly 2 centuries following the plague, these skeletal narratives suggest that survival rates improved. Despite repeated outbreaks of pestilence, famine, and even climate shocks like volcanic winters, the average person began to live a bit longer. Life did not become easy, but it became slightly more survivable. Yet questions linger. Did this brutal selection truly leave a mark on our genetics? In 1998, researchers proposed that survivors of the Black Death might have passed on a mutation, a protective genetic trait that made them resistant to future pandemics. The candidate was a rare allele known as CCR532. This mutation, when inherited from both parents, can confer resistance to certain viruses, most famously HIV/AIDS. Its frequency is noticeably higher in European populations than in others, and its origins, researchers speculated, might trace back to the plague. But this hypothesis, alluring as it is, has faced scrutiny. The distribution of the CCR532 gene does not match perfectly with the regions hardest hit by the Black Death. Some areas with high allele frequency experienced milder plague outbreaks. Other scientists have suggested smallpox rather than plague as a more likely driving force for the spread of CCR532, given its long presence in Europe and its viral nature. Still, the idea that medieval suffering might echo into modern immunity captures the imagination. Whether or not this specific gene links to the Black Death, the broader truth remains. Pandemics shape us. Through death, they sift the living. Through trauma, they remake societies. And across time, they leave marks we cannot always see, but often carry. As you lie there, listening gently, in the soft hush of evening, let this story settle into your thoughts, like falling dust in an abandoned chapel. The Black Death, with all its terror, left more than bones behind. It left strength. It left change. It left the quiet lesson that even the darkest times give way to dawn. You are here, after all, because someone long ago survived what seemed unsurvivable. Now let that quiet comfort guide you deeper into rest.